The night Harriet Bowen saved a man's life, she was wearing rubber gloves and carrying a mop bucket. That part never made it into any official report. It never made it into the papers either, because the men in that room, the ones in tailored suits with gold cufflinks and cold eyes, had a mutual interest in making sure nothing from that evening ever surfaced anywhere. But Harriet remembered every word, every glance, every second of silence that stretched across that boardroom like a wire pulled too tight. She remembered because that was what Harriet did. She remembered things. It wasn't a skill she'd ever advertised. Growing up in Dayton, Ohio, the second daughter of a postal worker and a school cafeteria cook, there hadn't been much occasion to mention that she could hear a conversation once, and carry it in her head for years afterward, intact like a pressed flower between the pages of a book. Her mother had called it a gift. Her high school guidance counselor had called it a strong auditory learning style and suggested she consider vocational training. Her ex-boyfriend, the one who left when she was 26, had called it. She was 31 now. 31, 214 pounds, and employed by a commercial cleaning company called Sparkle Pro that serviced office buildings throughout downtown Cincinnati. She wore a navy blue uniform with her name stitched above the left breast pocket in white thread, Harriet. She wore orthopedic shoes because her feet ached at the end of long shifts. She wore her hair pulled back and she kept her head down, and she cleaned, methodically, floor by floor, room by room, the way her mother had taught her to do any task worth doing. She was not supposed to be on the 42nd floor that night. She was supposed to be on 39, finishing the East Wing bathrooms before midnight. But the elevator had stopped at 42 without explanation. She'd pressed the button for lobby, and the doors had simply opened, and before she could press anything else, the motion sensor light in the corridor had flickered on, and she had wheeled her cart out of habit, the way you do when your body knows its job better than your brain does. She realized her mistake almost immediately. The 42nd floor of the Caldwell Group building was not part of her regular rotation. It was leased entirely by a private equity firm called Graymark Capital, and according to her supervisor, it was cleaned only on Tuesdays and Fridays by a separate crew. Tonight was Wednesday. The floor was dark. The corridor was empty. She turned to go back. That was when she heard the voices. They were coming from behind the double doors at the end of the hall, the ones with frosted glass panels and brushed steel handles, the boardroom. The voices were low, but in the particular way that low voices travel in empty buildings at night, they were perfectly audible. She heard English first, accented and formal, then something else. Something she recognized before she could stop herself from recognizing it. Mandarin. Specifically, a Shanghainese-inflected Mandarin that her college roommate's father had spoken at the dinner table on the 2 occasions Harriet had been invited home for the holidays. She heard a second voice respond, and this one was different. Cantonese, she thought. Yes, Cantonese, with the particular tonal quality of someone who'd learned it as an adult. She should have left. She knew she should have left. Instead, Harriet Bowen pushed her cart silently to the side of the corridor, pressed herself against the wall beside the boardroom doors and listened. The meeting inside had been going on for some time, she gathered. The English voices were tense. There were at least 4 of them, maybe 5. American, she thought, all of them, though one had a faint trace of something European underneath. She heard the name Graymark several times. She heard the word jurisdiction and the word exposure and the word unacceptable, each spoken in the clipped, over-controlled register of men who were trying not to raise their voices. And then she heard the man she would later come to know as Dorian Ashcroft say, in a voice that suggested he had never once in his life been told no, "Where is the translator? I was told there would be a translator." There was a shuffling. A pause. "Mr. Lai Ang's associates requested a Mandarin interpreter," said someone else, younger, confirmed for tonight. "He called in sick an hour ago. We have a backup, but he's what?" Another pause, longer this time. "He's not here yet." The silence that followed was the kind that cost people things, jobs, investments, sometimes more. Harriet's hand was flat against the wall. She could feel her own pulse in her palm. Through the frosted glass she could make out shapes, figures seated around a long table, the blue-white glow of a screen at the far end, the silhouettes of men who had not moved in several seconds. She counted them, 7, 8, maybe 9. She could not see faces clearly. What she could see was the door handle. It was 6 inches from her right hand. Later, she would not be able to explain what made her do it. She would try. She would try many times, lying awake in her apartment on Elm Street with the window cracked and the sound of traffic below, and she would never find a satisfying answer. Maybe it was the tone of the young, anxious voice, the way it had cracked slightly on the last syllable. Maybe it was the years of being invisible in rooms like this one, moving through spaces where men in suits made decisions that rippled outward and never once looked up from their documents to notice the woman emptying their trash. Maybe it was something simpler. Maybe she was just tired. She pressed down on the handle and opened the door. Every head in the room turned. There were 9 men. 9 men in suits that cost more than Harriet's monthly rent, seated around a table of polished, dark wood with water glasses and leather portfolios, and the remains of a catered dinner pushed to one end. At the head of the table sat a man she would later identify as Dorian Ashcroft. 47, dark-haired, going silver at the temples, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome once and now settled for authoritative. To his right sat 2 men she did not recognize. Across the table, 3 men she identified immediately as the Liang party. The eldest in a charcoal suit, the other 2 flanking him like parentheses. In the corner near the window stood a younger man with a tablet in his hands and the expression of someone who had already mentally drafted his resignation letter. "Who the hell is this?" said one of the men to Dorian's right. Harriet had learned at some point in her life, she couldn't have said exactly when, not to flinch. "My name. With the cleaning crew. I got turned around on the elevator." She paused. "I heard you need a Mandarin interpreter." The room was very still. "You," said the man who had spoken, late 50s, heavy jaw, a watch that caught the light, a cleaning woman. "I am," Harriet said. "I'm also fluent in Mandarin and Cantonese, and I've been standing outside that door for approximately 4 minutes, so I know what the disagreement is about, and I know that Mr. Liang's associate told your backup interpreter, the one who hasn't arrived, that the terms you proposed this afternoon were, and I'm quoting directly, an insult dressed up in a nice shirt." Another silence. Dorian Ashcroft had not moved. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't immediately read. Not contempt exactly, more like a man recalculating a sum he thought he'd already solved. Mr. Liang, the elder, spoke. He spoke in Mandarin, quickly, and his words were directed at his 2 associates rather than at anyone on Dorian's side of the table. Harriet listened. Then she said, in English, addressing Dorian, "He's asking his associate whether they should leave. His associate is advising against it. He says the flight back is tomorrow morning, and the alternative deal they were considering fell through last week. They're here because they have to be, not because they want to be." The room did not breathe. Dorian looked at her for a long moment. "Sit down," he said. She sat. What happened over the next hour and 40 minutes was the strangest professional experience of Harriet Bowen's life, and she had once cleaned the bathroom of a pharmaceutical company the morning after an office party that had apparently ended in a small fire. She sat at the corner of the table with her hands folded, and her cart outside in the corridor, and she translated back and forth, sentence by sentence, every exchange between Dorian's team and the Liang party. She was careful, she was precise. She did not editorialize, and she did not simplify, and when the legal terminology became dense, she asked for a 30-second pause to ensure accuracy, which the young man with the tablet, whose name, she gathered, was Fletcher, provided by pulling up reference documents on his screen. She did something else, too, something she didn't announce. She listened to what wasn't being translated. The Liang party had a habit, she noticed, of speaking among themselves in the gaps, the moments between exchanges when the Greymark team was conferring quietly in English and presumably believed the other side wasn't paying attention. These side conversations were brief. Fragments. The kind of thing you'd miss if you didn't know both languages and weren't listening carefully. The first one she caught. A murmured exchange between the two younger Liang associates in Cantonese about a clause in the contract that they believed Dorian's team hadn't read carefully. They were right. She had noticed it too. She let it go for the moment. The second, a comment from Mr. Liang himself, again in Mandarin, about the man to Dorian's right, the one with the watch. He said the man's numbers didn't match what they'd been told in the preliminary documents. He said the difference was not small. Harriet's pencil, borrowed from Fletcher, paused over her notepad. She looked at the man with the watch. His name was Prescott Hale. She'd heard it used 3 times in the first 20 minutes. He was Dorian's financial director, and he had been the one speaking most confidently about the projected returns on the deal. He had slides. He had charts. He had a particular way of clicking his pen between sentences that she had found irritating from the start. She set down the pencil. When Dorian's team finished their internal exchange and looked to her for the next translation, she rendered it accurately. But when Prescott Hale's numbers came up again, as they did, 10 minutes later in a direct question from Mr. Liang's associate about the Q3 figures, she translated the question exactly, and she watched Prescott's face when he answered. He didn't hesitate. He gave the same numbers he'd given before, and she knows. She thought, he knows, and Dorian doesn't know he knows. The meeting broke at 11:40 for a recess. The Liang party was escorted to an adjacent room. Dorian's team remained. Fletcher began gathering papers. The man with the watch poured himself a glass of water and checked his phone. Dorian looked at Harriet. "You've been doing this for how long?" he said. "Cleaning?" "Buildings about 3 years. That's not what I mean." She met his gaze. He had grey eyes, she noticed, and a habit of complete stillness when he was thinking that reminded her vaguely of her college statistics professor. "Languages," she said. "Since I was young. I pick them up easily. I have 7, plus some working knowledge of 2 others. 7, he repeated. Mandarin, Cantonese, Spanish, French, Portuguese, Japanese, and Arabic. The working knowledge is Korean and Russian. Russian more than Korean. Something shifted behind his eyes. She couldn't name it. "And you work for Sparkle Pro." "I do. Why?" It was the kind of question that came with assumptions loaded into it like ammunition, and she had learned not to take the bait, she said, simply because they hired me. He looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. I'm not sure I know how to do anything else," she said. "The Liang party," he said, during the session. "Were there things they said to each other that you chose not to translate?" She had expected many questions. She had not expected that one. She took a breath. "Yes," she said. Dorian Ashcroft was very still. "Before you make a decision about that," she said, "I want to tell you something about Prescott Hale," she told him. She told him precisely, clearly, in the way she had organized it in her own mind during the last 20 minutes of the session, what she had heard from the Liang side, what she had observed in Prescott's responses, what the discrepancy in the numbers suggested, and what she believed it meant for the deal. She was not a financial analyst. She said so. But she had a very good memory, and she had listened carefully, and what she laid out for Dorian Ashcroft in the next 6 minutes was a picture of a man on his own team who had been feeding the Liang party's advance representatives different figures than the ones appearing in tonight's formal presentation. She stopped talking. Dorian did not look at Prescott. He did not look at anyone. He was looking at the table. Then he said, quietly, "Fletcher, get legal on the phone." Fletcher looked at Prescott. Prescott looked at Harriet. In the fraction of a second before his expression smoothed over, she saw something there, a flash of something cold and calibrated that confirmed what she'd suspected. He had understood exactly what she'd done. He stood. "I need to use the restroom," he said. "Sit down, Prescott," said Dorian. The way he said it was not loud. It didn't need to be. Prescott sat down. What happened next took another 40 minutes and involved legal on speakerphone, a great deal of document cross-referencing by Fletcher, and one phone call that Dorian stepped out to make privately. Harriet sat in the corner with her hands folded and did not touch her phone and did not speak unless spoken to. At some point, someone put a glass of water in front of her. She drank it. The Liang party was brought back in. The deal was restructured, with Harriet translating every word in real time for 2 more hours. The clause she had noticed, the one the Liang associates had mentioned in Cantonese, was corrected. It had not been in Greymark's favor. The correction cost them something, but the cost, Dorian said later, was significantly smaller than the alternative. At 1:47 in the morning, Mr. Liang extended his hand across the table to Dorian Ashcroft. They shook. At 1:52, Harriet retrieved her cart from the corridor and pressed the elevator button for the lobby. The doors were closing when she heard footsteps behind her. "Hold the elevator." She held it. Dorian stepped in. He was carrying his jacket over one arm, and he had loosened his tie somewhere in the last 40 minutes. And in the artificial light of the elevator, he looked less like a man who ran a private equity firm and more like a man who hadn't slept in 30 hours. They descended in silence for 3 floors. Then he said, "What are you doing on Friday?" She looked at him. "Working," she said. "I'm on the 36th floor on Friday." "I meant after." She considered several responses. "I genuinely have no idea what you're asking me. I'm asking if you'd be willing to consult for Greymark." "Formally, on retainer." He paused. "Our interpretive services contract comes up for renewal in 6 weeks. I'd like to restructure it entirely." "I'm a cleaning woman," she said. "You're a woman who speaks 7 languages, catches financial discrepancies in real time, and made a judgment call tonight that saved this company from a very expensive mistake." He looked straight ahead at the elevator doors. "What you do between 9 and 5 doesn't change any of that." Harriet thought about her orthopedic shoes. She thought about her apartment on Elm Street. She thought about her mother, who had worked 30 years in a school cafeteria and retired with a bad back and a pension that just barely covered rent, and who had always said, when Harriet came home discouraged, "You are more than what they see when they look at you, baby." She thought about Prescott Hale's face, in that fraction of a second before the mask went back up, and the satisfaction she had felt. Quiet and clean and entirely her own. In that moment, "I'd need a proper contract," she said. "Naturally, and I'd want to finish out my current obligations with Sparkle Pro, give proper notice. I don't leave things undone. I wouldn't expect otherwise." The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. The security desk was empty at this hour. Just the overhead lights and the marble floor and the night outside the glass doors, the city still lit and humming the way cities do when the rest of the world is asleep. Harriet stepped out. She turned. Dorian Ashcroft was looking at her with that same expression from before, the one she'd clocked at the moment she first opened the door, recalculating, revising. "One more thing," he said. She waited. "The offer from Liang's second associate," he said. "The one he made at 11:22 in Cantonese. The one you didn't translate." She was quiet. What did he say? She had been waiting for this question since the moment she'd made the decision not to translate it. She had thought about how to answer it. She had prepared 2 versions, one careful, one direct, and now, standing in the lobby at 2 in the morning with her cart beside her and the city outside, and this man watching her from the elevator with an expression she still couldn't entirely read, she chose the direct one. He said that if the deal fell through tonight, she said, they had already identified a contact inside Greymark who was willing to continue negotiations privately, separately from you. And Dorian Ashcroft said nothing for a moment. Because, she said, "I wanted to see your face when Prescott's numbers didn't add up." He looked at her, just looked for a long still moment, the elevator doors held open by his hand. Then, slowly, he smiled. It was not a large smile. It didn't need to be. "Friday," he said. 8 o'clock. I'll have a draft agreement ready. The doors closed. Harriet Bowen stood in the lobby of the Caldwell Group building with her mop cart and her navy uniform and her orthopedic shoes, and she breathed out slowly, the way you do when something you've held carefully for a long time is finally, safely, set down. Outside, the city glittered the way it always did. Indifferent, vast. She pushed her cart toward the service exit, and she did not look back, because she had never been the kind of woman who needed to.